All right. So today we will continue with where we started last time. Remember, in this case, we are looking at a movement known as the Indo-European migrations. These happen because of a worldwide drought that affects not just the civilizations that we have studied, but also those nomadic tribes that are wandering back and forth across Asia. Okay, and so in search of food and supplies and materials and all of the other stuff, remember that under normal circumstances they would come, they would raid, they would pillage, they would kidnap, they would burn things down, they would carry things away, and they'd be happy. But now, as they're doing this, the villages and the areas that they would normally just go and pillage also don't have a whole lot. And in many cases, many of these villages and cities and societies have themselves collapsed. Okay? And so these hordes that have been wandering across Asia for thousands of years begin to settle in those areas, okay? And so if you recall, over time, they do have two effects on the local people. Number one, they bring their languages with them, and they do in fact mix language with the people. And it is this mixture of languages that leads to many of the ancient languages that we are looking at and studying that eventually transform into many of the modern European languages via either Greek or Latin, okay, because they do have that effect, number one. Number two, because in order to be constantly on the move and following their herds of animals, it is these Central Asian tribes that develop a horse culture, and so they are the first to domesticate the horse and use it for transportation and for labor and for war and all kinds of stuff. And so they bring a horse culture into the areas. Okay, and I put chariots in parentheses because they're also the ones who invent the chariot, and so they bring that along as well. On whatever day that was, Monday, we looked at two of the tribes. First off, the Hyksos. The Hyksos invade Egypt, and they basically bring an end to the Middle Kingdom. Okay, remember though that the Hyksos only controlled Egypt for about 100 years. About 3/4 of the way, about maybe 70-ish years, 75 years after their invasion, led by a man named Ahmosis. The Egyptians are able to overthrow the Hyksos by adopting their weapons, adopting their strategy, and using it against them. Okay? And then, of course, once the Hyksos are expelled, this is the period of time when Egypt becomes a military power because they realize, hey, we're not going to let this happen to us again. Okay? The next one, and this is where we left off, and we'll kind of pick up with them, are the Amorites. Okay? The Amorites are the next tribe, and they invade Mesopotamia. Okay? Sometimes the Amorites are known as the Babylonians in different texts because that was their capital city, the city of Babylon. Okay, Babylon. Okay, they constructed it, and it became a pretty magnificent city. We left off talking about one of their most famous kings, okay? Because unlike the Egyptians, the Amorites or the Babylonians are able to maintain control in Mesopotamia. They mix with the people, they blend their language, they blend their culture, okay? and we eventually get a whole new society. Okay, and of course we finished off talking about Hammurabi's code. Okay, Hammurabi was one of the kings, and of course this one's important because typically most of us think of eye for an eye. Okay, you know, the different laws, the different punishments. But remember, it was more than that. It also involved classifying people into different social classes. It outlined the responsibilities of each social class. It outlined, you know, not just criminal penalties, but penalties for, you know, negligence, penalties for, you know, whatever, okay? And even though we do talk about eye for an eye, okay, was that truly the way punishments were decided? Well, no, it was just part of it, okay? Remember, depending on your social class, and let's say as the offender, the social class of the person that was hurt, okay, typically determined what would happen to you. I left off, and hopefully you look at this separate presentation, because one of your assignments for this chapter, okay, is in fact, okay, you know, answering some questions about Hammurabi's code, okay, and so, you know, remember, yeah, to a certain degree it was eye for an eye, but only if you were of the same social class, okay? If you were a higher social class and the person you hurt was a lower social class, you could just pay and your penalty was fulfilled, okay? Remember that the lowest of the social classes was slave. If you hurt a slave, okay, then you paid the owner half of the slave's value, okay? Now, of course, if it went the other way, if you were of a lower class and you hit or you hurt or you broke a tooth, whatever, of an upper class person, you were whipped 60 times in public, okay? You're not losing your tooth, you're not paying a fine, you're getting whipped. And if you were a slave, you were just put to death, okay? Type of thing. Now, I wanted to go into, just as a side note, okay, the concept of slavery really, really quick, because unfortunately, all right, and it, of course it doesn't excuse it, slavery has existed since the beginning of humanity, okay? Since the earliest civilizations, slavery has always been a thing amongst humans, okay? But originally, it literally had nothing to do with skin color or anything like that, okay? That is, if I want to give a term, modern slavery, okay? Slavery, you know, that was brought, you know, with the Europeans, I guess, European explorers. Originally, slavery was just basically like, you got two societies that go to war, okay? And the losing side become the slaves, okay? My city and I want to say Melody City go to war. Melody City beats my city, and so all of the residents of my city now become the slaves of her city, and that was it. So didn't matter black, white, pink, purple, didn't matter your profession, didn't matter like what you did, okay? You became the slaves of the winning side, all right? Now, slavery was not perpetual, okay? Meaning that, you know, if you were a slave and you had children, your children would be born free, okay? Because, you know, it was Dad that lost the war, not me, all right? So the children were free, okay? Even though the parents were slaves, okay? And of course, even as a prisoner of war, okay, you could still manage to buy your freedom. It was easier, okay, than what came later on. All right? Now, this was slavery for the early parts of humanity, okay? Eventually, okay, and this happens, this happens in Persia and amongst the Assyrians, a group known as the Assyrians. They introduced the concept of debt slaves or debt slavery, okay? What was that? Well, basically, if you are pretty bad with money and you find yourself in debt to someone, then you could do either two things. You could offer yourself up to the person you owe money to as their slave, and you would actually work out a contract. Okay, and so I become Zan's slave for 8 years to pay off the debt that I owe him. Okay, or I could go to my best friend Melody here and say, Melody, could you pay off my debt to Zan? All right, and then I would become her slave. Okay, and once again, there would be some kind of contract or agreed upon term. Okay, so you literally sold yourself into slavery. Okay, now, because you were like a debt slave, it was only because you couldn't afford to pay off your debts. I mean, obviously, you have to find a way to still sustain yourself and hopefully, in addition to being a slave, provide and pay things off. You could still work, you could still do other things, you still had some semblance of freedom, but in the end, your loyalty was to, whomever was either paying your debt or to whom you owed a debt to. And once you fulfilled your contract, you were free. Okay? My debt has been paid. So I'm back to normal. All right? There were some cultures that instituted slavery as a prison sentence, okay, where you commit a crime and your punishment is to be a slave. Okay? Yeah.
That sort of still happens.
Yeah, kind of. All right. And so in this case, and especially if the crime, let's say I killed Zan's, mother, sorry, then my sentence was to be his slave, all right, as punishment, okay, type of thing, all right. Now, of course, if it was something less than murder, okay, then, if I was sentenced to, 10 years, Santos, you got a choice, 10 years in prison or 15 years as Zan's slave, then it's like, oh, I'll take the slave, all right? And once my 15-year sentence was up, then my freedom was granted to me, okay? Just as if I had been sent to jail, okay? The saddest one, all right, and this happened quite a bit in most cultures as well, is that you were sold by your parents into slavery, okay? A couple has too many children, they can't afford to feed them all right? So you can either let them starve to death, I suppose, or you take one of your kids, you sell it as a slave, you take it to the slave market, somebody buys the kid, and so it's kind of a win-win if you're the parent, not if you're the kid, all right? Because number one, you get money, because you need money, that's why you're selling the kid, all right? And number two, that's one less mouth to feed. Okay, so you don't have to worry about sustaining that person anymore. All right, and so you keep having too many kids, then you sell them into slavery, type of thing. Okay, slavery, the way we think about it today, where it's Africans and they're taken from Africa and kidnapped and brought on ships, and they work cotton or sugar or whatever. Okay, and of course they were black, all right? That doesn't happen until, Europeans begin to explore Africa and take people from there, okay? And so in this case, people were literally kidnapped, all right? It was something perpetual, all right? You were a slave forever. You had kids, your kids were slaves, their kids were slaves, their kids were slaves, okay, etc. Okay, and in fact, just to point out, all right, the word slave actually comes from the word Slav. Okay, because, and I think we'll get into this at the end of this class, in the 800s, during the Middle Ages, one of the European kingdoms, the kingdom of the Franks under Charlemagne, the way that they made their money was actually by invading Eastern Europe and kidnapping the people there who were Slavic, who were Slavs, and then after kidnapping them, they would sell them as slaves to other groups. And so literally that's where the word slave comes from, because for a period of time during the Middle Ages, most of the people that were sold into slavery were Slavic, okay, type of thing. And so, you know, otherwise we'd use another word, okay? So, all right, just a brief, quick history here on slavery, all right? Now, let's get back to the Amorites, okay? Just two more things, and then we'll move on to the next group, okay? As I mentioned before, the Mesopotamians, specifically Sumerians, but you know, when Akkad invaded, you know, the south, they took all of the things that the Mesopotamians there had invented and had done all of that. When the Amorites move in, okay, they see all of the art, all of the learning, the writing, everything that the Mesopotamians have accomplished, and they're basically like, okay, you know, do that for us now, okay? Let's make, you know, Amorite or Babylonian art. Let's make Babylonian sculpture. And take our language and use those things right there and you know, come up with our stuff too. Write it down, okay? And in this case, they took many of the Mesopotamian stories, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay? And they're like, we love it. Okay, translate it into our language. Okay, write it down for us so we can read it and we can repeat it.
What language did they translate it into? Do we know?
The Amorite language.
Babylonian.
Babylonian, yeah. I honestly don't know
If it has a name.
if it has a name, yeah. Okay, but the language that they spoke. Okay, type of thing. Okay, now the fun thing is here is that even though the Epic of Gilgamesh does have a story about a great flood, okay, it doesn't appear until the Amorites get involved, okay? And as I've mentioned before, many of the creation stories and many of these old myths and legends and whatnot, okay, a lot of them have stories about a flood. Okay, and of course, some of you pointed out, well, if these early societies were by the river, I mean, obviously, yeah, okay, in a sense that unlike what those of you who are either Judeo-Christian, you know, it wasn't a worldwide flood, it was a local phenomenon type of thing. Okay, now, there we go, okay. Some of the things that the Amorites brought with them, okay, and this is one of the reasons why the Babylonian kings were pretty popular. Okay, number one, we begin to see, and we later see this in other groups, where, well, let me take a step back. In order for a government to function, a government needs money. Okay, the easiest way for a government to make money is everybody's favorite T word, taxes. Okay, you tax the people, that's how the government gets money. Okay, and with that money, the government does what it's, you know, what it does. Okay, now, we all love taxes, right? I see nobody agreeing with me. Some of you are giving me sarcastic smiles. All right.
In theory, perhaps.
Well, maybe in theory. Not even in theory, dude. I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to walk down to HR and be like, excuse me, can you take more money out of my paycheck so you know, Donald Trump has extra cash on him? You know, yeah. You know, whatever. No. You know, no. And But just as an FYI, you know you can do that. You can ask to have more taxes taken out of your paycheck.
What?
Leo's like, what the fuck? You're like, oh, no way, man, I ain't doing that shit. No, you can, all right? If you really love the government, okay? Type of thing. But, okay, people felt the same way about taxes even back then. And so what the Babylonian kings do is they allow private ventures. They allow private companies to become the tax collectors, okay? And so, number one. Number two, the government only wanted silver or gold or some kind of precious metal. Whereas the majority of the people, and we're still functioning on a semi-barter system here, okay? You can't go and be like, all right, king, here's like 3 goats for taxes, all right? And so what would happen is we have, a private business. I bring my 3 goats to Ivy. Ivy says, okay, your tax obligation is fulfilled. And then Ivy turns around and pays the government in silver, okay? Obviously taking a slight percentage for themselves because they are providing a service, okay? And there you go. Now, when the people get mad about the high taxes, our king here says, I'm not the one who collects the taxes. If you're mad, be mad at Ivy's taxes anymore. Okay? Because they're the ones that are taking taxes from you. It isn't me. Alright? I only get like a little bit from it from them. Okay? They're the one that's collecting money. Okay? And so, for the first time, we see this. Now, later on, the Persians, the Romans, a couple other groups have a similar like tax collection system. Alright? Part of it is PR. All right, because no, don't hate me. Hate the tax collectors. Okay, part of it is that. Another part, of course, is the fact that we have a farmer here who's going to bring me 10 cows as their tax. What am I going to do with 10 cows? All right, no. You take it to someone who takes the 10 cows, and then they convert that into gold, silver, whatever the local currency is at that time in history. And then they, of course, pay the government in that minus their own cut, all right, from it. Okay? Now, the other thing, don't forget that Mesopotamia is right in the middle of pretty much everything. And so people going back and forth, are either, bringing goods and services to the area, even if they're just passing through, like they have to, stay at hotels and buy food, and they have to, do all of that, bring business, okay, and so on. Maybe they need their wagons fixed, maybe they need a new, horse, boom. All right, so that is important for business. So the Amorites, become pretty wealthy and pretty important and a pretty good sized state, and they are around for several hundred years. Okay, now we're going to leave them alone and move on to the third tribe that we want to look at, and these are the Hittites. Okay, so back and forth across Asia, all right, worldwide drought, okay? And so, third tribe that decides to come down and invade, they are a group known as the Hittites. They invade an area called Anatolia, okay? I am going to ask you, Anatolia is modern-day Turkey, okay? So if I say, so what is Anatolia called today? It's called Turkey, okay? Anyone know why we call it Turkey? Ivy?
Like, didn't you say that, like, that the people who first, like, came to that country were called the Turks? Or
Okay.
the people who inhabited it for something like that?
Yes, not the first, but they are the ones that eventually, it's a group of people known as the Turks, and so it takes the name Turkey, not because there's a lot of gobble, 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 like all over the place, okay? But yes, it's named after a group of people known as the Turks.
I know that rather recently they didn't like the English language association with the bird, so they officially changed the spelling.
Yeah, they did. It's like EI or something like that.
Yeah, there's like 2 dots over one of the
Yes,
letters or something.
they tried to change the spelling, but you know, I still spell it like the bird. Okay, but yeah, and I know, you know, every now and then there's like some confusion, you know, like, you know, Hungary, it's not named because the people there were always wanting food. It's right, yeah, it's named after the Huns. Okay, type of thing. So, but anyways, Anatolia, modern day Turkey. Anatolia is the name of the land. Okay, the area. Now, most of it is highland and flat, okay? But you do have to climb mountains to get to that highland, to that flat area. And so for a couple thousand years, the people that live there, okay, are okay. All right, they're, you know, they're doing their thing. If you recall, you know, for the most part, even though there aren't a lot of farmland, there is a lot of, you know, animals, and so you see mostly pastoral communities. But amongst some of the other people, because they are in the mountains, you do see mining and whatnot. And so these are the groups of people that throughout history gave the ancient Mesopotamians, you know, the bronze, the tin, not the bronze, the copper, the tin, all right, so that they could make bronze, other precious metals, you know. It is mountainous, so there's forests. You know, early Mesopotamians traded with the people in Anatolia for wood and whatnot. Okay, and so down come the Hittites. They invade. You know, they have their horses and chariots. You're fighting against mostly miners and shepherds. So, you know, the Hittites are able to overwhelm the area very, very quickly. Okay, and just like we've talked about, okay, they settle down, they begin to mix with the locals, their language mixes with the local language, and so we get, you know, and of course they bring their horse culture, etc., etc. Okay, over time, you know, and they retain the name Hittite. Okay, over time, you know, they absorb all of the people, and eventually they begin to control and consolidate their power here in Anatolia. Okay, they build the city of Hattusa, which becomes their capital. And once they've solidified control in Anatolia, they begin to expand outside of that area. Okay? One of the groups of people that they encounter as they begin to conquer other areas are the Egyptians. Okay? Now, these are the post-Hyksos Egyptians. Okay? The Egyptians that have, you know, adopted a military strategy, a military attitude. Okay? Remember also the Battle of Megiddo. What is the significance of the Battle of Megiddo? Yes, chariots on chariots. Okay? The Egyptians and their chariots that they took from the Hyksos, and the Hittites who already had them. Okay? Because up until this point, the Hittites have fought people that didn't have them, and same with the Egyptians. Okay? So, all right. Now, there's one more battle I want you to remember, and that is the Battle of Kadesh. Okay? Same opponents. Okay? After the Battle of Megiddo, it's kind of like, well, what if we bring even more chariots? All right? And both sides thought the same thing. The Battle of Kadesh is the largest chariot battle in history. It is estimated that both the Hittites and the Egyptians each had like 25,000 chariots going at each other. Okay? Reading accounts and stuff like that, it's like people were like, it was like an earthquake, just like coming at each other. All right? With all of these horses and chariots you're just fighting. Okay? Just like the Battle of Megiddo, spoiler alert, it's a draw. All right? Neither side is able to gain an advantage on the other than lots of destroyed chariots and dead horses. okay, like type of thing, but both sides withdraw, okay? It is after the Battle of Kadesh that the Hittites realize, okay, we can't keep this up for very long, all right? And so, number one. Number two, the Egyptians are pretty powerful, okay? So, maybe we should make peace with them, and maybe we should agree, you guys are over there, we're over here, and, let's try to not get into each other's business, okay? So they become a little bit more diplomatic. They do sign a peace treaty with the Egyptians, okay? And the idea, of course, was that, war is bad for business, okay? It doesn't matter how much trade, how much profit we make, if we have to turn around and either sink that into war, because, and this is a principle that applies even today, wars cost money, all right? Don't let anyone trick you, all right? Wars will always cost money, either now or in the future, okay? And if we're making all kinds of money, but then we just have to turn around and finance a war with it, then what's the point, okay? And so, isn't it better if we just not fight and keep all that money, all right, type of thing? And so, after this final encounter with the Egyptians, the Hittites become known as diplomats, as, they are all, they've still got the muscle to back it up, but they will try negotiation, they will try diplomacy first, okay? Because once again, what's the point in having made all of this money and having made all of this, trade and trade agreements, if we're just going to have to use it to finance another war? Let's make that our last resort. Let's try, okay? And in this case, the Hittites are pretty successful in negotiating treaties with other areas and negotiating, trade agreements with areas. Okay, it's not enough to just we're not going to fight each other, but hey, you've got cool stuff, we've got cool stuff. Let's work out a treaty where we can trade, and both of us benefit. Both of us will get rich. Okay, and so yeah. Okay. Now, of course, bless you. Eventually, they do have to fight, but for several hundred years, the Hittite Empire, the Hittite group, is pretty successful. All right. Finally, the last group we're going to look at, and probably the most significant one, because it does establish what we think of as modern-day India, okay? And that is India, okay? Now, the tribe that moves into India, they are known as the Aryans, okay? Now, just as a little side note, okay, fast forward to Germany in the 1930s and Adolf Hitler, and Hitler actually takes the word Aryan to describe tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, the perfect race, okay? Here, okay, but he got the term from ancient India. In this case, the Aryans were just one of the many tribes that were wandering across Central Asia, okay? And so they are the ones that enter India. The term Aryan means respected ones. And just like every other group, like the Hyksos and the Amorites and the Hittites, they were nomadic, they were warriors, okay? They brought their horses and chariots, okay? And of course, their language eventually mixes with the local Indian languages, and, boom, okay? Now, just as a side note, and I'll mention this again when we talk about the Persians, some Aryan groups as they were wandering south, decided to not make the complete journey. And so some of them settled in Persia, or what today we call Iran. The name Iran literally means land of the Aryans. Okay? So, they spread themselves around in that area quite a bit. Okay? So, just a map to show then where most of the tribes end up, and there's a couple that we're not going to talk about, like the Mitanni and a couple other ones, but there's quite a few. Okay, we're just looking at 4 of the big ones. Okay, now this period in Indian history, okay, when the Aryans come down and mix with them and mix their language and mix their culture, etc., etc. And once again, this happens over several hundred years, okay? It is known as the Vedic period or Vedic India, okay? As opposed to Harappan India, which was the earliest, okay, Indian society, all right? Now, we get the name Vedic from something known as the Vedas, which are basically poems or hymns that were written that, basically they're predominantly religious in nature, but they do include other things and other information. And that is basically where we get most of our knowledge about the Aryans and the early Vedic period. Okay, what do we learn from the Vedas? Okay, besides religion, and we will talk about that in a minute. Number one, the Aryans, and like I said, eventually when they mix with the local culture, so pretty much everyone, wine and music. Okay, they were partiers. All right, they celebrated quite a bit. Okay, number 2, they had a patriarchal society. Okay, when we say patriarchal, we're not just talking about a male-dominated society, but okay, it doesn't matter if you're a man and you're in your 30s or 40s and you have your family and etc. If dad, even if he's 80 years old, is still alive, okay, guess who's in charge of you, even if you're in your 40s and you have your own family? Yes, dad. Thanks, dad. All right? You will always listen to the patriarch, okay? You defer all judgment to him. Okay, so in this case, it was always the oldest male of the clan or the family or the group. Okay, we know that the Aryans were polytheistic. What do we mean by polytheistic again? Lots of gods, multiple gods. Okay, once again, I cannot emphasize it enough. Remember that during these times, polytheism was the norm. Okay, monotheism, one God, was weird. Okay, part of the demands that the gods made was animal sacrifice. Okay, and while we do see that in other cultures, this is one of the first mentions that we get. Okay. Yeah, the Egyptians, you had ceremonies. Yeah, the Mesopotamians, you went up on a ziggurat and you prayed and you did stuff. Okay, you had ceremonies, you had parties, you had festivals. Okay, but this is one of the first actual mentions of killing an animal and offering it to the gods. Okay, they believed in life after death. Okay, now, I specifically worded it this way because unlike the Egyptians, they didn't believe in an afterlife. They quite literally believed in life after death. Yes?
Is this kind of where like the Buddhist ideology came from?
Yeah. Okay, this is the basic. This is where it starts. Okay, you're thinking a couple hundred years later, but this is where it starts. Yes. Okay, now, whereas the Egyptians believed that you would need your body and your stuff from before for the next life. Okay, the Vedics, and eventually this does lead to, like, Buddhism and all of that, believed that you would have another life. They referred to it as either reincarnation or the transmigration of souls. Okay, so there was another life, but you don't need this old body because you would have a new one, type of thing. Okay, because they do come from a warrior culture. Okay, bravery, warriors, victory, fighting, all of that was good. And of course, because you can't always be doing it, then let's have some competition amongst us. Okay, let's have some games. Let's have something that shows your prowess without actually having to fight. And so the game of chess, for example, is credited to the Aryans, to the Vedic period, because you're able to show your thinking, your strategy, type of thing, even if you're not fighting other people. Okay, now, one of the differences from, well, the Hyksos, they did conquer Egypt but couldn't hold it. The Amorites mixed with the Mesopotamians and created their own kingdom, and the Hittites mixed with the local Anatolians and created their own kingdom. Okay, one of the things about the Aryans, though, is that everything went along just like the other groups. They came in, they influenced, they changed, they adopted, they blended, but the Aryans didn't consolidate power. The Aryans had separate kingdoms. Okay, each group had its own individual state. Okay, the Amorites took over all of Mesopotamia, and that was all Babylonian. Okay, not with the Aryans. Okay, and so this area breaks up into, quite literally, at some point, hundreds of kingdoms. Eventually, they get whittled down to just dozens. Okay, and each of them is led by the title that each individual king took was a Raja. Okay, sometimes if you ruled over more than one area, you were a Maharaja. Okay, but basically your title was Raja. All right, and just as a FYI, India is not united until the British forced them to, like way like thousands of years later.
I have noticed that India has a lot of languages.
Yeah.
So I guess this is part of the reason why.
Yeah, they were never truly unified until much later, until they were forced to by Europeans. But yes, they started off as multiple kingdoms. Okay? Questions? Because I'm going to stop right here. Yes?
Is this why Pakistan and India hate each other?
Well, that has to do with Islam. Okay, don't tell any Pakistani or Indian I said this, but Pakistan is basically Muslim Indians, and India is Hindu Indians. That's like the biggest difference. They'll be like, shut the fuck up. No, it's this, it's that. But that's what it boils down to, is religion. All right, I don't want to start China because then I'll just have to stop